All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to continue with our information relating to integumentary system. So where we left off, we were talking about the functions of skin. We were discussing how the skin has a number of different functions that provide for the human body to strive and do what it needs to do. I linked this video. It was in the About section for my last video. I love these TED Ed videos. I think they do an amazing job of covering content that we go over, but also giving more visual aids and getting into a little bit more in depth. So I think it's a great video to watch. It's talking about skin color and why there's so much diversity within our species. Today, we're going to focus primarily on the different types of tissue that exist. Now, this is not necessarily something unique to just integumentary system, because some of this tissue is not skin related, but it's stuff that we learn in this unit. It's kind of applicable. So there are 4 types of tissue: muscle tissue, epithelial, connective, and nervous. The good news is, out of those 4, 2 of those have pretty common sense names, right? Muscle, nervous. Okay, well, muscular system and nervous system. The rest are a little bit trickier, but we'll get there as we progress. Muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is made up of excitable cells that are long and fibrous. So if you were to cut a muscle in half and kind of zoom in with a powerful microscope, this is kind of like what you'd see. I always think of like the analogy I think of is like a box of pasta, like the angel hair pasta, very, very thin. But when you open up the box, there's a bunch of strands just kind of tightly coiled together. That's what we observe here. Now, we have an entire chapter covering muscular system in quarter 3, so we will learn much more about this. But the way that a muscle works is kind of like an accordion. When you squeeze an accordion in, it makes sound. It also makes sound when you squeeze out, but that's the point, that you're squeezing in. Muscles are similar. When you squeeze a muscle in, it contracts and it generates force. That force is necessary for every single action that we commit. Me moving my hands right now, me talking right now, that's all muscles that are activating. It just so happens that those muscles have been used for so long. In my case, those are muscles I've been using for 29 years of my life. So those muscles are very accommodated to what they're doing. Muscle memory. They don't require too much more to do what they need to do. But that said, we've all been there before where you're writing down your notes, right? And you're writing, and then suddenly, boom, 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 and suddenly your palm just starts getting really sore. Muscles do have a limit on how much they can do and how much they can perform, which we'll learn all about that in muscular system. Epithelial tissue. Okay, so this one gets a little bit trickier. So regarding epithelial tissue, first of all, when I was in college and I learned this stuff, we had to learn somewhere 8 different types of epithelial tissue. We don't need to worry about that. First, I want you to observe that this first bullet right here, all that's talking about is the shape. So that's just talking about the shape of the cell. So there's 3 columns, or there's three categories of shapes, if we want to call it that: flat, cuboidal, and columnar. Flat cells is literally as if you're looking at a piece of paper. It's 2D. There's no dimension to it. Cuboidal is what you see in this picture here. You can see cuboidal cells. I think of little tiny Rubik's cubes or ice cubes. They're just cubes. And then columnar, you can see in the top right area, columnar is going to be more along the lines of very thin and tall, like columns. Now, the purpose of epithelial tissue is what we really need to pay attention to. So the purpose of epithelial tissue is going to be an excellent protective covering. So I'm going to try to underline that for us to the best that I can. And not only is it found on the outside, because your skin, more specifically the epidermis, the outer layer of skin, is considered epithelial, but you also find it internally too, because it lines the internal cavities and organs. So interestingly enough, like the outer lining of the small intestine, which is found in your intestine region, right, in your lower abdomen area, that tissue is going to be very similar to the tissue that you find on your skin, as far as physiologically speaking. And anatomically speaking, like the look of the tissue is going to be a little bit different, because that's what the shapes are relating to. Okay, so again, how can you summarize your epithelial tissue? You just summarize it into understanding that it's relating to protective coverings. It's just a covering, right? Connective tissue. I think this is probably the hardest one to remember, not because of what it does. I think the job of connective tissue is very simple. It's just that you see these 6 different types of connective tissue. We need to know this for our purposes in our tests. So first of all, what does connective tissue do? Well, it's in the name. Connective tissue connects parts of the body together. So it makes up a connective web, holds body parts together, provides support, fills in the spaces inside our body with a gel-like matrix. Our body is a well-oiled machine. There's not a lot of areas of your body where it's just emptiness and gaps and space, right? So instead of that, you have all of these connective tissues that are essential. And this is just showing us the arm, like the elbow region. This connective tissue exists all over the body. So let's go through these one by one. We do need to know them for our purposes. So we have letter A, loose connective tissue. When you read that, it's like, what? What does that even mean? But look at the parentheses. It says under the skin. Well, hold on. Didn't I say just recently that the skin is epithelial? It is. The skin is unique. The skin is both epithelial and connective. The top, it just depends on the layer of skin. The top layer of skin that you physically can see, that's all epithelial. Right under the epithelial layer, you have connective tissue. When we get into our next video, it's going to make a little bit more sense, so bear with me. Letter B. Letter B is going to be called fibrous connective tissue. Here, let me recircle that because I kind of cut it a little bit. Fibrous connective tissue. So fibrous connective tissue, again, you read that and you're like, huh, what does that even mean? But if you're an athlete, if you play a sport, or if you're a fan of sports, you should know what a tendon is or a ligament. These are incredibly important tissue that connect bone to bone and bones to muscle. So we'll get much more in that when we do muscular systems, so we don't have to worry about it just yet. Letter C, adipose tissue. If you don't know what adipose is, I would define it for us. So adipose equals fat. Now, again, the problem with the word fat is that it's all contextual. There's too many definitions. Fat could be referring to the lipids, like the macromolecule. Fat could be used as an insult to somebody. Fat could be referring to adipose, which is your fat cells. So to clarify, to make sure that there are no issues, we're just going to say adipose tissue. Remember, in my last video, I mentioned how the vast majority of your body's fat, or your adipose, is going to be found in the skin. Next, we have cartilage. This is another tissue that we're going to learn much more about in skeletal system. If you play sports, like I said, you should know what cartilage is. Cartilage is this gel-like material found on the ends of bones. It makes it so that when the bones come in contact with each other, they kind of glide. They can kind of glide right off each other. That's important. If the cartilage wears down, which it does for all of us, right? It's called wear and tear. But if the cartilage wears down enough, that gliding process turns into like a grinding, really rough process. That's, first of all, very painful. You will feel that. And second of all, it tears apart the cartilage, and then it starts to actually chip away at the bone, and it can cause fracturing. It's a big reason why for professional athletes, you don't typically see people who are professional athletes post their mid-30s. It depends on the sport, obviously, but high contact sports, yeah, it's really rare because cartilage is just going to be wearing down pretty fast. Next, we have bone. We have an entire chapter covering bones, skeletal system. And if you look at a skeleton, you can tell that it holds the body together. That's one of the things that connective tissue does. Last, but certainly not least, we have blood. Here, let me redraw that for us real quick. Now, blood, I'm going to actually draw a little star next to it, mainly because I feel like most people forget this one. It's not because people forget what blood is. I think most people have a basic understanding of what blood is. It's mostly because the blood is one of the connective tissue that most people just ignore. If you think about what connective tissue does, that it fills the spaces inside of our body, all those arteries, all those veins, all those vessels, they're not empty. They need to be filled. And what are they filled with? Blood. So overall, that's what we're talking about regarding connective tissue. Not bad, not too terribly difficult. Just got to make sure we're comfortable with what we see here. So let me go ahead and erase. Make this a little bit bigger. There we go. Okay. And moving on. Nervous tissue. This is a little bit easier, right? If you've taken some sort of psychology course or other science classes, you should know what the cell is. And if you don't even recognize the cell, it's not a big deal because we have chapters covering this stuff. But nervous tissue is found within the nervous system, as the name implies. And it's made up of specialized cells. What are those specialized cells called? Neurons. So we'll learn all about that in the future. The way the nervous tissue works is like an electrical circuit. The nervous system transmits nervous signals from spinal cord and brain. The analogy I love to give is that the nervous system works just like the electrical grid. Our buildings, our schools, our houses, our residences, they have electricity, right? But what provides that electricity? You don't really see big generators out there unless, people have generators, especially for hurricane proofing. What provides that electricity are power plants. Now, obviously, there's different sources of energy for power plants, but power plants generate that electricity. The power plant would be like the brain. The brain generates a ton of electricity and it's communicating information constantly at very, very, very fast speeds. Now, in my power plant analogy, how do we get energy from the power plant to the buildings? The power lines. It's the stuff you see when you're driving, and it's the lines that connect everything. And that takes the energy to your houses and your buildings and your schools and everything in between. The power lines would be our nerves. Our nerves travel throughout our body, constantly picking up and sending information back and forth, back and forth. So it's just like the electrical grid. That's the way I like to think of it as far as how your nervous system tends to work. Finally, to finish this up for today, I know there's a typo in the bottom. The epidermis, actually, let me see if I can actually edit that. There you go. The epidermis is going to be, we have 3 layers of skin. I honestly think of these layers of skin like a piece of pie. The epidermis is going to be more like the toppings that you'd put on pie, like whipped cream sometimes. The dermis is going to be more like the filling, so like where you find the actual chunks of fruit. And then the hypodermis is going to be like the crust. It holds it all together. So let's talk a little bit more about this pie that we're mentioning. The epidermis is made up of epithelial cells. Hey, we just talked about that in this video. Epithelial cells, so it's that outer covering. A big thing to take note of is that it's considered avascular. Avascular. Vascular meant it's pertaining to blood, so it's related to blood. Avascular means no blood. So this is very important. If you scratch your skin, and I'm talking just like a soft scratch, not clawing. If you scratch your skin, you'll notice no blood pops up. That entire layer has no blood. The dermis, it is known as the true skin. So that is the more appropriate, that is a nickname that it tends to have. So I'd make sure we know that. It's made up of connective tissue. Hey, we talked about that today too in our video. Connective tissue is literally going to connect parts together. It is vascular, meaning there are arteries, there are veins here. Finally, the hypodermis. It's also known as the subcutaneous layer. I don't typically call it subcutaneous too often, but just in case, that's another name. It attaches the integument, otherwise known as the skin, to your muscle. So it attaches the skin to the muscle and it keeps it all together. And all that yellow stuff that you see in the hypodermis is stuff that we're going to talk about in a future video. That's adipose. That's fat, right? So it all connects together really, really well. All right. Okay, so I think that's a great place for us to stop as far as our content for today. Again, going to continue moving forward with our material, making good progress. Other than that, guys, thanks for tuning in. Hope you have a great one.